My grandson looked me in the eye at 19 years old and told me a photograph of me could wait, but a party at somebody else's lake house could not. I sat in a folding chair in an empty studio on a Saturday morning in September, dressed in the good blue shirt I'd bought just for that day, and I listened to that sentence land in my chest like a dropped wrench. 3 grandchildren canceled that morning. 1 granddaughter didn't. That's the whole story right there, if you want the short version. But I don't do short versions, so stay with me. My name is Dennis Whitfield. I'm 71 years old. I ran a hardware store on Charlotte Street in Asheville, North Carolina for 36 years, Whitfield Hardware and Feed, before I sold the building and retired in 2021. I believed, for most of my life, that if you showed up for people consistently enough, for long enough, they would eventually show up for you. I was wrong about that. Not about all of them, but wrong enough that it nearly broke something in me I didn't know could break. This is the story of the worst Saturday of my life, and the Thanksgiving that came 4 months later that put things right in a way I never saw coming. Let me back up. I want to be clear about something before I go any further, because people ask me this every time I tell this story out loud. I am not a bitter man. I don't go looking for reasons to feel wronged. I spent 36 years standing behind a counter on Charlotte Street selling nails and propane tanks and garden hose to half of Buncombe County. And in all that time, I don't think I raised my voice at more than a dozen customers, and every single one of them deserved it. I built that store from a cinder block shell my father-in-law owned into a business that put 2 kids through college and paid off a house on Kenilworth Road with a wraparound porch and a red maple tree Carol planted the year Ryan was born. Carol was my wife. 46 years. She passed in March of 2021, a stroke that took her fast, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning while she was making coffee. I was in the next room. I heard the mug hit the floor before I heard anything else, and by the time I got to her, she was already somewhere I couldn't follow. I don't tell you that for sympathy. I tell you that because everything that happened after it only makes sense once you understand that I've already buried the one person I built my whole life around, and I know exactly what silence in a house sounds like when it's permanent. We had 2 children. Ryan, my son, is 43 now. He's a vice president at a regional bank branch over in Weaverville, married to a woman named Kimberly who sells real estate up and down the French Broad River corridor. They have 2 kids, Tyler, who was 19 that September, a sophomore at Appalachian State, and Brooke, who was 16, a junior at Reynolds High School. My daughter is Sasha. She's 40, a charge nurse over at Mission Hospital, married to a good, quiet man named Trevor Combs who does electrical work for a contractor out of Black Mountain. They have 2 kids as well. Mason, 21, a senior at UNC Asheville, and Ivy, who was 14 that fall, in the 8th grade at Black Mountain Middle School. I loved all 4 of those grandchildren the exact same amount the day each one of them was born. I want that on the record. This isn't a story about a grandfather who always liked one grandchild better. It's a story about what happens when love gets tested on one specific Saturday morning, and only one of them showed up for the test. In July of 2025, I went in for a routine physical, the kind Carol used to nag me into every single year, and that I'd been skipping since she died, because nobody was around to nag me anymore. My PSA number came back elevated. Dr. Sarah Klein, my urologist over at Mission, didn't panic me, but she didn't sugarcoat it either. She ordered a biopsy for the 2nd week of August. I sat in that waiting room on Biltmore Avenue by myself, filled out the paperwork by myself, and drove myself home afterward with 6 little bandage dots on a part of my body I'd rather not describe on camera. 2 weeks later, she called me into her office and told me it was stage 1 prostate cancer. Contained. Treatable. A very good prognosis if we moved fast. Surgery scheduled for early October. I want you to understand something about that phone call, though. Before she said the word treatable, before she said contained, there was about 4 seconds of silence on the line while she pulled up my chart, and in those 4 seconds I thought I was about to hear the word I'd heard about my wife's heart 3 years earlier. For seconds. That's not very long. It felt like a season of my life. I drove home that day and sat on my back porch on Kenilworth Road, and I did something I hadn't let myself do in a long time. I thought about what I actually had, in terms that mattered. Not the store, long since sold. Not the retirement accounts, which were healthy enough. I thought about the fact that somewhere in a drawer in my study, I had exactly one photograph of all 6 of us together, taken at Ivy's christening 14 years earlier, and it was blurry, and Carol was in it. and none of the grandchildren looked like themselves anymore. I thought about the fact that if that surgery in October didn't go the way Dr. Klein expected, whatever came next, whatever anybody put in a frame at a funeral home, would be that same blurry photograph from 14 years ago. I decided that was not going to happen. I called a photography studio the next morning. The place was called Bluebird Portrait Studio on Marymount Avenue, a little storefront between a coffee shop and a place that sold vintage records. The woman who ran it, a photographer named Denise Okafor, had done Sasha and Trevor's wedding photos back in 2009, and I trusted her. I booked a 2-hour session for Saturday, September 20th, at 10 in the morning. Full family. 3 generations. I paid $480 up front for the session package and told Denise I wanted individual portraits, sibling groupings, and one big shot of all of us together, the kind you frame and hang in a hallway, the kind that ends up in an obituary slideshow, whether anybody wants to think about that or not. I called Ryan first, then Sasha, and I told both of them the truth. I told them about the diagnosis, the surgery date, the whole thing, and I told them I wanted this photo session before I went under anesthesia, not because I expected the worst, but because I'd learned the hard way with Carol that you don't get to choose when the last good photograph gets taken. You only get to choose whether you bothered to take it while you still could. Sasha cried on the phone. She said, "Dad, of course. Whatever you need, we'll be there, all of us." Trevor got on the line after her and said the same thing in fewer words, which is just how Trevor talks. Ryan was quieter. He said, "That's a lot to process, Dad. Cancer. Are you sure you're okay?" And I told him I was going to be fine, that this was precautionary, a good news story with an inconvenient middle chapter. He said he'd check with Kimberly and the kids about the schedule and get back to me. That should have told me something. It didn't, not yet. I texted the date and time into the family group chat we'd had going for a couple of years, the one called Whitfield Fam, the one with all 6 of us plus Trevor and Kimberly in it. September 20th, 10 a.m., Bluebird Portrait Studio, were something you'd be comfortable seeing on a wall for the next 30 years. I got a thumbs up from Sasha within the hour. I got one from Trevor a few minutes after that. Mason texted, "I'll be there. Love you, Pop." Ivy sent a photo of a little cartoon camera with hearts around it, which is exactly the kind of thing a 14-year-old sends, and it made me smile for the first time in about 2 weeks. Ryan, Kimberly, Tyler, and Brooke didn't respond at all. Not that day. Not the next day. I told myself they were busy. I want you to remember I said that, because I said a version of that sentence to myself an awful lot over the following 6 weeks, and every single time it turned out to be the wrong thing to tell myself. I didn't know it yet, but 3 weeks before that photo session, on a completely ordinary Tuesday, a 19-year-old fraternity brother of Tyler's named Wyatt Sorensen had already picked a date for a lake house party at his family's place out on Lake Lure, a graduation celebration for Wyatt's older sister, open bar for anyone over 18, live band, the whole production. And that date happened to be September 20th. I found all this out much later. At the time, all I knew was that I had a full family group chat with 6 thumbs ups and hearts, and a session booked, and a good blue shirt hanging pressed in my closet ready. The Thursday before the shoot, I called my oldest friend, a man named Walt Higgins, who lives 2 doors down from me on Kenilworth Road and has for 30 years. Walt's a retired mail carrier, 73 years old, plays gin rummy with me every Thursday night on my back porch, and has known me long enough to hear things in my voice that I don't say out loud. I told him about the photo session coming up. He asked how I was feeling about the surgery. I said fine. He said, "Dennis, you don't sound fine. You sound like a man rehearsing a speech." I told him I wasn't rehearsing anything. I was just looking forward to Saturday. Walt let that sit for a second and then said, "All right. But you call me Saturday night either way. I want to hear how it went." I told him I would. I didn't know yet how much I'd need that call. Saturday, September 20th. I woke up at 6, which was 2 hours earlier than I needed to, and I ironed that blue shirt myself even though it had already been pressed, because my hands needed something to do. I got to Bluebird Portrait Studio at 9:40, 20 minutes early, and Denise Okafor had the lights already set up, a soft gray backdrop, a little bench, everything professional and warm. At 9:50, Sasha, Trevor, Mason, and Ivy walked in together, and for about 10 minutes, everything felt exactly the way I'd pictured it in my head back in August. Ivy hugged me first thing and said, "You look sharp, Grandpa," and touched the collar of my shirt like she was straightening it, even though it didn't need straightening. Mason shook my hand and then pulled me into a hug anyway, which he'd never really done as a little kid, being more of a handshake kind of boy even at age 9, so that meant something to me. At 9:58, my phone buzzed. A text from Kimberly. "So sorry, Dennis. Tyler and Brooke have a thing today, and honestly Ryan's got a work call he can't move. Can we reschedule for another day?" I stood in the lobby of that studio holding my phone, and I remember Denise looking over at me with a question on her face, because the session was booked for 6 people, and it was 9:58, and I only had 4. I texted back, "What kind of thing?" I didn't get an answer for 11 minutes. 11 minutes, standing there in a shirt I'd ironed twice. At 10:09, my phone buzzed again, but it wasn't from Kimberly this time. It was a screenshot, forwarded by accident. Still to this day, I don't fully understand how. But somebody in that family group chat, and I believe now it was Brooke, had typed a message meant for a different, smaller group chat, one that apparently existed between just the 4 cousins, called something like Fam Chat No Olds. Instead it landed in the big Whitfield Fam Chat, the one with my name in it. It read, "Guys, Wyatt's party starts at 11. Lake Lure's like an hour and 40 minutes away. We can't do both Grandpa's photo thing and that. Tyler already told Wyatt we're coming. Grandpa can wait, he's not even sick. He's fine. The surgery isn't even for like 3 more weeks. This is a one-time thing." Brooke deleting this in 2 seconds. She did not delete it in 2 seconds. It sat there in that chat, visible to me, for the better part of an hour before somebody finally pulled it down, and by then I'd already read it 4 times. Grandpa can wait. I stood in that lobby on Marymount Avenue holding my phone, and Ivy came over and put her hand on my arm and said, "You okay, Grandpa? And I want you to understand, I did not tell that 14-year-old girl what her cousin had typed." I put the phone in my pocket, and I said, "I'm great, sweetheart. Let's go make some pictures." And we did. Denise Okafor took the most beautiful photographs of my life that morning. 4 generations reduced to 4 people, because 2 of them were 16 and 19 and 40 minutes from a lake house full of strangers, and one of them was 43 years old and apparently had a work call on a Saturday that couldn't be moved for his own father's cancer photographs. I smiled in every single one of those pictures. I want you to know that. Denise complimented me twice on how relaxed I looked. I have never worked harder at anything in 36 years of retail than I worked at looking relaxed for 2 hours in that studio. That evening, Walt Higgins came by like he said he would, and I poured us both 2 fingers of bourbon, and I showed him the screenshot on my phone without saying a word. Walt read it twice. Then he set the phone down on my kitchen table very gently, the way you set down something you're afraid might go off, and he said, "Dennis, I've known you 30 years, and I've never once seen you let somebody walk on you without saying something. Why are you being so quiet about this?" I told him I didn't know yet what I wanted to say. I told him I needed time to figure out if this was one bad Saturday from 2 kids who didn't know better, or if it was something bigger that I'd been too busy grieving Carol and running my own doctor's appointments to notice. Walt looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're a hardware man, Dennis. You know the difference between a crack in the foundation and a crack in the paint. Go find out which one this is before you decide anything." That was the best advice anybody gave me the entire fall, and I took it seriously. If you've made it this far, welcome to Sweet Family Revenge Stories, the place for real family stories that end the way they should. Grab your coffee, get comfortable, because this story is about to take a turn nobody in my family saw coming. If you're enjoying it so far, go ahead and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because what I found out over the next 6 weeks was so much worse than one skipped photo session. And what I did about it is the part everybody asks me to tell twice. Here's what I didn't know that Saturday night, sitting with Walt on my back porch. I didn't know that this wasn't the first thing. It was just the first thing I'd noticed. The following Tuesday, I had a follow-up appointment with Dr. Klein to finalize the surgery date, and afterward I stopped by my longtime attorney's office on Patton Avenue to update some paperwork, some routine stuff I'd been meaning to handle since Carol passed. My attorney is a woman named Grace Sutter, mid-50s, sharp as anything, been handling my legal affairs for almost 20 years, going back to when she helped me incorporate the hardware store as an LLC in the mid-2000s. I sat down across from her desk, and before I could even get into what I'd come for, she said, "Dennis, I want to mention something, and I want to be upfront that I debated whether to bring it up at all, because it's a little outside the normal lines of what I'd usually tell a client. I told her to go ahead. She said that 3 weeks earlier, her office had received a call from Ryan. Not about anything urgent, she said, but he'd asked her paralegal some fairly specific questions about how the family trust I'd set up years ago was structured, specifically how quickly assets could be distributed if something happened to me, and whether the trust would be affected one way or another by a serious medical event. Grace, said her paralegal, not realizing the sensitivity of it, had answered in general terms, the kind of generic answer you'd give anyone, and then mentioned the call to Grace afterward almost as an aside. Grace told me she wasn't accusing my son of anything untoward. People ask those questions for all kinds of reasons. But she said given everything else, given the timing, 3 days after I'd told the family about my diagnosis, she thought I should know. I sat in that office on Patton Avenue and felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with prostate cancer. My son had learned his father had cancer on a Tuesday, and by Friday of that same week, he was on the phone with my attorney's office asking how fast a trust liquidates. I didn't say anything to Ryan yet. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't ready. Instead, I drove home and I did something I hadn't done since I ran a business, which is I started keeping records. I bought a plain black notebook at the CVS on Tunnel Road, and I started writing down dates, times, and exact words, the way I used to track inventory discrepancies at the store. September 20th. The photo session. The text. The screenshot. September 23rd. The conversation with Grace Sutter. I didn't know yet what I was building toward. I just knew that a man who spent 36 years running a small business learns one lesson above all others, which is that you don't confront anybody with a feeling. You confront them with a fact, or you don't confront them at all. Over the following weeks, more pieces came in, mostly without my even going looking for them, because once you start paying attention, the world hands you things it was hiding in plain sight the whole time. My surgery happened on October 8th at Mission Hospital, a nerve-sparing prostatectomy that went, according to Dr. Klein, about as well as it possibly could have. I was in recovery for 2 nights. Sasha took 2 days off work and sat with me both of them, brought Ivy by after school on the second day. With a get-well-soon card, Ivy had made herself out of construction paper, a drawing of the two of us standing in front of what I assume was supposed to be my old hardware store, with a little cartoon sun overhead. I still have that card. It's in the drawer of my nightstand, right next to Carol's reading glasses, which I've never been able to make myself throw away. Ryan visited once, for about 25 minutes, on the first evening, and spent roughly half of that time on his phone answering what he told me were urgent work messages. Kimberly did not come. Tyler texted me a single message that said Hope's surgery went well pop 3 days after the fact, when I was already home. Brooke never texted at all, not one word, though I did notice she posted a photo on social media that same week from a homecoming dance, smiling in a green dress in front of somebody's decorated garage, having what looked like a perfectly wonderful October. Mason called me twice during my recovery, both times just to talk. No agenda. Once to tell me about a class he was taking on small engine repair that reminded him of afternoons in my store as a kid, and once just to ask how I was sleeping. Mason, I should say, had been at Lake Lure that day too. I want to be fair about that. He had gone to the party. But something in the way he called me afterward, unprompted, twice, without his mother telling him to, told me there was a difference between a young man who'd made one bad choice on one Saturday and gone home feeling a little sick about it, and a young man who'd made that choice and never thought about it again. By the middle of November, my black notebook had a page I kept coming back to more than any other. It was dated November 4th, a Tuesday, and it recorded a conversation Walt Higgins had, entirely by accident, at the Weaverville branch of the bank where he does his own checking account business, the same branch where my son Ryan works as a vice president. Walt had gone in to sort out a dispute on a debit card charge, and Ryan happened to walk past the teller window while Walt was there, and stopped to make small talk, the way people do when they've known each other 30 years through me. Walt told him I was recovering well from surgery. And then, according to Walt, Ryan said, unprompted, something to the effect of, "Yeah, we're just trying to get a handle on what things look like going forward. Kimberly's been talking to a financial planner about restructuring some things on our end, just being smart about it." Walt said it was the tone that stuck with him more than the words. He said it sounded less like a son worried about his father's health, and more like a man doing quarterly planning. I want to pause here, because I know exactly what some of you listening are thinking. You're thinking, Dennis, maybe you're reading too much into this. Maybe your son really did have a work call that Saturday. Maybe the trust questions were innocent curiosity. Maybe the bank comment meant nothing at all. I thought all of that too. I sat with those doubts for weeks because I did not want to believe what I was starting to believe that my only son and his wife had, without ever saying it out loud to my face, already begun mentally dividing up what I'd spent 36 years building, while I was still very much alive, still very much in the fight, still very much their father. But here is the thing about a man who ran a small hardware business for 36 years. You learn to read a set of books. And when I laid every single piece out on my kitchen table in that black notebook, side by side, the skipped photo session, the 11-minute delay before an answer, the screenshot that should never have reached me, the call to my attorney's office 3 days after my diagnosis, the 25-minute hospital visit split with a phone, the silence from Brooke, the bank comment to Walt. It didn't read like a string of coincidences anymore. It read like a pattern. And patterns, in a set of books, are never accidents. I called Grace Sutter and made an appointment for the following Monday, November 10th. I told her I wanted to talk about my will, my trust, and the college funds I'd set up years earlier for all 4 grandchildren. Grace sat across from me in her office and listened to the whole thing, start to finish, the photo session, the screenshot, the bank comment, all of it. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk and said, "Dennis, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about the answer before you give it to me. Do you want to punish anybody, or do you want to protect what you built?" I told her the honest answer, which was both, but that I only trusted myself to act on the second one. She nodded slowly and said, "Then let's talk about what you actually have." What I had was this: a trust established back in 2018 when Carol was still alive, that held roughly the value of the sale of the hardware store building, plus my retirement accounts, structured to eventually split between my 2 children and, separately, for education sub-accounts, one for each grandchild, meant to fund college and set up automatically to release funds at age 18 for tuition, room, and board. Tyler's had already been drawn on for 2 years of Appalachian State tuition. Mason's had funded most of his time at UNC Asheville. Brooks was sitting untouched since she was still in high school. And Ivy's, the youngest, had the most time left to grow and the most life left ahead of it. I also had the house on Kenilworth Road, Carol's red maple tree in the front yard, and one item that had nothing to do with money at all, which was a genuine 1962 Snap-on toolbox. My father's, the one thing I'd carried with me from job to job since I was 17 years old, the one thing every grandchild had, at one point or another as a small child, sat cross-legged on my garage floor and asked to open, just to look inside at the neat rows of chrome. Grace and I spent that Monday afternoon and 2 more meetings across the following weeks, restructuring things. Not out of anger. I want to be very clear about that, because I know how this can sound. I told Grace, and I meant it, that I was not trying to hurt Tyler or Brooke or even Ryan and Kimberly. I was trying to make sure that the parts of what I'd built that were meant to reward showing up actually rewarded showing up, instead of being handed out automatically to anyone who happened to share my blood, regardless of whether they'd ever once, in a hard season of my life, chosen me over a party at somebody else's lake house. We drew up new documents. Ivy's education sub-account would be restructured into a fully funded, irrevocable trust covering not just college but graduate school if she wanted it, released under the supervision of an independent trustee, completely separate from anything her parents could touch or direct. Mason's remaining balance would stay untouched, because whatever had happened that one Saturday in September, 2 phone calls during my recovery told me something about the kind of man he was actually becoming. Tyler and Brooke's remaining education funds would not be eliminated, because I am not a cruel man, and I do not believe an 18 and a 16-year-old should be permanently sentenced for one selfish Saturday, but they would be frozen and placed under review, contingent on a real conversation, a real accounting, before another dollar moved. And the house on Kenilworth Road, along with Carol's red maple and the rest of what remained after the trusts, would be restructured so that Ryan and Kimberly's share was reduced by a significant, deliberate percentage, redirected instead into Ivy's trust and into a smaller fund earmarked for Sasha. Because my daughter had shown up to every single hard thing in my life for the last 3 years without ever once asking what was in it for her. The last thing I asked Grace to draw up was a simple letter of instruction regarding the Snap-on toolbox. It would go to Ivy, along with the shop key I still carried on my ring even though the building had sold years ago, a key that no longer opened anything, but that I couldn't make myself throw away, the same way I couldn't throw away Carol's reading glasses. Grace had everything finalized and notarized by the 3rd week of November. I told her I wanted to handle the reveal myself, in person, and I told her exactly how I wanted to do it. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Dennis, are you sure you want an audience for this?" I told her I was sure. I told her that everything that had gone wrong that September had happened in a room full of people, my absence noticed by exactly 1 child out of 4. Whatever came next was going to happen in a room full of people too. I called Sasha on the Sunday before Thanksgiving and asked if she'd host this year. I told her I wanted the whole family there, no exceptions, Ryan and Kimberly and both their kids included, and I told her, and this part was true, that I had something important to share about my health and about the future of the family, and I wanted everybody in the same room to hear it together instead of getting pieces of it secondhand. I did not lie to her outright, but I let the ambiguity of that sentence do exactly what I needed it to do. Word travels fast in a family, even a fractured one. By the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, I had missed calls from Kimberly, a long text from Ryan asking if everything was okay with my recovery, and even a message from Tyler, the first direct communication from that boy since the surgery, asking, "Everything all right, Pop? Mom said you have something to tell us." I didn't answer any of them beyond a short line that said we'd talk Thursday. I wanted them arriving at that table with questions, not answers. I wanted, for the first time since September 20th, for my family to have to wait on me. Thanksgiving fell on November 27th that year. Sasha and Trevor's place in Black Mountain filled up by 2 in the afternoon. The smell of a turkey Trevor had been smoking since 8 that morning drifting through the whole house. Ivy setting the table with the good china Sasha only brought out twice a year. Mason carrying and folding chairs from the garage without being asked. Ryan and Kimberly arrived at 2:40, Tyler and Brooke trailing in behind them, both of them noticeably quieter than I remembered them being at any Thanksgiving before. Nobody, I noticed, brought up the lake house, or the party, or September at all. It sat in the room the way an unpaid bill sits in a drawer, everybody aware of it, nobody willing to open it. We ate at 4. I want to tell you the meal was tense, but honestly, it wasn't, not entirely. Ivy told a long, meandering story about a school science fair project involving a volcano that had, against all instructions, actually erupted in her bedroom 2 weeks earlier, and even Kimberly laughed at that one, genuinely. There were good minutes in that dinner. I want that on the record too, because I never wanted this story to be one where everybody was a villain every single second. People are more complicated than that, and so was that table. At 5:15, after the pie had been cut, I asked everybody to stay seated for a few minutes, because I had something I wanted to say. The room went quiet the way rooms do when somebody who has just had cancer surgery 2 months earlier says he has something to say. I watched Kimberly's hand find Ryan's under the table. I watched Tyler set down his fork. I told them, first, the true and good news. Dr. Klein had confirmed at my 6-week follow-up that the surgery had gotten everything. Clean margins, no further treatment needed beyond routine monitoring. I let that land for a second, because I watched real relief move across every single face at that table, and I want to be fair and say I believe that relief was genuine, even from the ones who had not shown up in September. Then I said, I want to talk about September 20th. Nobody moved. I said it plainly, without raising my voice, the way I used to explain a return policy to a customer who already knew he was in the wrong. I told them about the photo session. I told them I understood, truly understood, that a 19-year-old and a 16-year-old wanting to go to a party instead of sitting for family portraits was, on its own, a very small and very human thing. The kind of small selfish choice every young person makes at some point and grows past. That was never really what hurt me, I told them. What hurt me was the 11 minutes of silence before anyone told me. What hurt me was a message that was never meant for my eyes, but that I read anyway, for words in particular that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. I looked directly at Tyler when I said them. Grandpa can wait. Tyler's face went the color of the tablecloth. Brooke stared at her plate. I said I understood that message wasn't written to hurt me on purpose. I said that almost made it worse, because it meant that was simply how it felt to write, Easy, automatic, unremarkable. Grandpa can wait. Like waiting was just what I did. Like I always had. Then I told them about Grace Sutter's office, and the phone call to her paralegal 3 days after my diagnosis, asking how quickly a trust could move. Ryan's face changed then, and I watched him look at Kimberly, and I watched Kimberly look at the tablecloth exactly the way Brooke had a moment earlier. Dad, Ryan started, that's not what that call was. I'm not finished, I said, and something in my voice, I suppose, told him to let me get there. I told them about Walt Higgins standing at a teller window in Weaverville, hearing about a financial planner and restructuring 3 weeks after my diagnosis, before I'd even had my surgery date confirmed. I said I wasn't going to pretend I knew every private conversation that had happened in that house in Weaverville. But I told them that a man spends 36 years reading a set of books, learns to see a pattern, and what I had seen, laid end to end, was a family that had, without ever once discussing it plainly with me, started planning for my absence while I was still very much fighting to be present. I reached down beside my chair and picked up a folder Grace had prepared, and I set 4 envelopes on the table, one for each grandchild, the same way. I'll admit, I once heard secondhand another father in another family did it, though my story and his have nothing else in common. Ivy's had her name written in my own hand. So did Mason's. So did Tyler's. So did Brooks. I started with Ivy, because I wanted the room to understand right away that this was not simply punishment, that it was also, and just as importantly, a reward. I told her, in front of everyone, that her education trust had been fully restructured, fully funded through graduate school if she ever wanted it, protected under an independent trustee, untouchable by anyone but her, activated the moment she turned 18. I told her that the toolbox in my garage, my father's Snap-on toolbox, the one she used to sit in front of as a little girl and ask to see inside, was hers, along with the old shop key on my ring, a key that opened nothing anymore. But that meant something to me that I couldn't fully explain, and that I wanted her to have it anyway. Ivy started crying before I even finished the sentence, and Sasha put her arm around her, and I watched Trevor, quiet Trevor, wipe at his own eyes with the back of his hand. And that, if you want to know the honest truth, was the moment I had been waiting for months to get to. I told Mason his account would remain exactly as it was, untouched, unchanged, and I told him, in front of his whole family, that 2 phone calls during a hospital recovery, made with no agenda and no audience, had told me more about his character than 100 group photographs ever could have. Then I turned to Tyler and Brooke. I told them their remaining education funds were frozen, not eliminated, frozen, pending a real conversation, one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with whether the 2 of them understood the difference between being young and being thoughtless, and whether they were willing to close that gap. I told them I loved them exactly as much as I loved Ivy and Mason, and that this wasn't about love. It was about what gets rewarded and what doesn't, in a family same as in a business, because the 2 are not as different as people like to pretend. Then I looked at Ryan and Kimberly, and I told them the house on Kenilworth Road, and what remained of the estate beyond the grandchildren's trusts, had been restructured. Their share was reduced. Sasha's had grown, not because I loved her more, I said, but because for 3 years she had shown up to every hospital room, every hard Tuesday, every ordinary phone call just to ask how I was sleeping, without once, not one single time, asking what any of it was worth. Kimberly's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. Dennis, this feels incredibly harsh for one Miss Saturday. It was never about the Saturday, I said, calm as I could manage. The Saturday just showed me where to look. Ryan didn't argue. I want you to know that. He sat there a long moment, staring at that envelope with his name on it. And then he said, quietly, can I still come to your appointments? The next follow-ups. Is that something I'm still allowed to do? That question, more than anything else that whole evening, told me my son wasn't entirely lost. I told him yes. I told him that door was never closed, that none of this was a door closing. It was a door being propped open honestly instead of pretending it had never needed propping at all. We sat at that table another hour. Nobody stormed out. Nobody raised their voice. It was quieter than any Thanksgiving I can remember, but it wasn't cold, not entirely. Ivy came around the table at one point and sat in my lap the way she hadn't done since she was maybe 9 years old. Too big for it now. Both of us a little embarrassed, both of us not caring. And she said, I would have come even if the trust thing wasn't happening, Grandpa. You know that, right? and I told her I did know that. That's exactly why it was happening at all. In the months since, some things have gotten better, and some things are still finding their shape. Tyler called me in January, on his own, no prompting from anybody, and asked if he could come by the house some Saturday and hear about the store, the real history of it, not the version he'd half listened to as a kid. He's come by 3 times since. We haven't fully closed the gap Grace and I talked about back in November, but I've watched him try, and trying, at 19, is not nothing. Brooke is quieter about it, still finding her footing, but she sent me a birthday card in February with an actual handwritten paragraph in it, longer than 4 words, and I read it twice. Ryan and I talk more now than we did before any of this happened, which is a strange thing to say about a season that started with him missing a photo session and asking my attorney about trust timelines. I think some part of him needed to be caught before he could stop and look at what he was becoming. I don't know that for certain. I only know what I've watched since. Mason graduates from UNC Asheville in May, and he already asked if I'd come sit in the family section. I told him I wouldn't miss it for anything on this earth. And Ivy, my Ivy, still comes by most Saturdays, and some afternoons we sit out in the garage together, and I open that old Snap-on toolbox, and I show her what each tool is for, the same way my father showed me on a concrete floor in 1968. She keeps the shop key on a little chain around her neck sometimes, even though, like I told her, it doesn't open anything anymore. She says that's not really the point of it. I think, at 14 years old, she understands something about what matters that took me 71 years and one very hard Saturday to finally learn all the way through. I think about that photograph a lot, the one from Bluebird Portrait Studio, the 4 of us, Sasha and Trevor and Mason and Ivy and me, standing against that soft gray backdrop, all of us smiling like nothing at all was wrong. It hangs in my hallway now, right where I always meant for the 6-person version to go. I look at it most mornings on my way to the kitchen. It doesn't feel like an absence to me anymore. It feels like a record of exactly who was standing there when it mattered, which, in the end, was always going to be the only photograph worth keeping. If this story meant something to you tonight, go ahead and hit that like button, leave a comment, and tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe to Sweet Family Revenge Stories so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you in the next story.